educator. Katie Bell is a local foods and small farms educator serving Edwards, Lawrence, Richland, Wabash, and Wayne counties in the kind of central Illinois area, I believe. She develops and delivers research-based programs that address all issues related to the local food systems. Katie Bell collaborates with extension educators, campus-based specialists, and various other agencies to provide timely and relevant programming focused around agronomic and horticulture crop production, including cover crops, pest management, soil and nutrient management, as well as food safety and security. So with that, I'm going to turn my video off, Katie, and I'll let you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Grant, and I appreciate that. I will also turn off my video just to help preserve the recording. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to say that tonight I'm going to be giving a really broad overview of managing horses on pasture, and then providing some tips for success that I have learned through my research and reading, and then also keeping my own horses on pasture. Um, I just want to also make a note that unless I'm specifically stating it, I'm typically talking about keeping a healthy horse with no metabolic issues or a lactating or otherwise compromised horse. So when we talk about some of the stats that I'm going to be giving about diet and what they can get from forage as opposed to a grain concentrate, I'm always talking about a healthy horse that's in a light to moderate amount of work. I also want to recognize that donkeys and ponies tend to have different dietary requirements and are not going to be some of the things that I'm saying about keeping horses on pasture may not hold true for donkeys, ponies, mules. So I just want to keep that in mind. In each, area that you're in, I am located in the south central part of Illinois, or actually, I don't know, I'm south and I'm kind of central, and then I'm also on the eastern side of the state. So I'm kind of, we don't know whether we're southern or central some days, but I'm in a much different climate than what folks in northern Illinois would be or in other states. And so I would also like to just kind of note that when I'm speaking, I'm generally speaking about my area, but if you have specific questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. Yeah. So I am going to just first talk about what makes equine pasture management different than managing pastures for other types of livestock. So we generally have different priorities and goals whenever we are focusing on our pasture for our horses. The purpose of the pasture that we're using is totally different than what we're using for other classes of livestock. Um, Sometimes we think of, horses and good pasture don't go together. This is often because of the way that we are using our pastures and the goals that we have with those. As a horse owner myself, why would you have just one horse when you can have two or three or four, um, in regards to the space? So we do generally have a tendency to overstock what our pasture is actually able to carry. Um, Horses have a very different grazing habit or can have a very different grazing habit than other classes of livestock and cattle. And so they can be a little bit more tricky to manage on pasture than other animals. Just not too far. Um, so with that, horses tend to be very picky about their grazing, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but they will remember the good spots and they'll go back to them and they will overgraze some areas and undergraze others. And since they are so notoriously picky, they will often not eat weeds. And if we aren't doing additional control on the weeds, then we will see more weed issues occur. Generally, horses can get a, almost 70% of their long stem forage from a pasture and maintain a healthy body weight and good energy. So why is it so difficult to keep them on a pasture? Um, so that's kind of what we're going to be talking to tonight before we actually start building up healthy pastures and things, because this is very important to keep in mind. So I mentioned horses graze a little bit differently than other animals. Uh, for starters, horses kind of prefer to graze that forage from 4 to 6 inches on that new growth. So they are really going to prefer that fast growing vegetation as opposed to stuff that's getting a little more stem to it, that is a little more mature. It's going to be more filling. Where the digestive tract of a cow, they have that big rumen and it's designed for breaking down somewhat more fibrous diet than what a horse's stomach is able to break down. So, where a lot of our cool season grasses, 6 inches is, 6 to 8 inches is the height that we want to start grazing, and then we want to graze them back to 4 inches. A horse is going to want to start grazing at a maximum of 6 inches, more like 4 or 5. And then if you let them, they'll take it all the way completely to the ground. But we want to try to take half and leave half, which I'll talk a little bit more about forage health in a bit. And I have a really great diagram to demonstrate that. One thing that you might need to do to encourage good even grazing is to clip your pastures throughout the spring periods of rapid growth, and then also clip for weeds. So in the wild, a horse can travel 30 to 40 miles a day. They're roaming grazers, and they will just keep moving and keep eating all day if they were allowed to. So that's really important to keep in mind whenever we think about pasture size and stocking density, because not only in our pastures are we providing them with food, but our goal is also to provide them with exercise and movement that is really key to their digestion and to their hoof health. So I find this Rutgers study very interesting. They put trackers on horses and monitored them, and they found that most of the horses walked around 10 miles a day, and they were in a pasture. So that was trips around the pasture, that was walking up to get water, grazing, moving around. And if they were just left on their own to graze, some horses would graze up to 18 hours a day. So when we think about that and then having fairly small acres or small pasture to manage on, they're grazing that pasture down quite a bit if they're grazing that long into the day. So another important thing to keep in mind whenever we are talking about feeding grain concentrates, which I won't mention too much, but I do want to touch on it, is grain concentrates are an awesome supplement to diet, especially for animals in work or animals for breeding, lactating mares, all that. But we need to keep in mind that when we're giving a concentrate, horses have the smallest stomach relative to body size of all of our domesticated animals. So whenever we are giving a grain concentrate, that's going to be processed in that actual physical stomach, which I have a great diagram here in a second. But that's going to be processed there mostly. And so if you want to get the most bang for your buck feeding a grain concentrate, you want to try to do smaller meals and maybe multiple feedings a day. So if you have a growing animal or an animal in really intense work, you may do 3 grain feedings a day and smaller size meals. So that way it can stay in the stomach long enough to process. And the other thing about a horse's hind gut, which is the second half of their digestive system, the microbiome in there is very specialized to the food source that they're eating. So if they are eating a lot of hay, that's going to be a very different pH than if we put them out onto fresh green pasture. And so we need to take special care to transition them slowly from, especially as we talk about going from winter to spring, from our dry lots or hay feed in the wintertime into that awesome green grass in the summertime. So we want to think about that because the hind gut, which consists of the cecum, the large colon, the small colon, and the rectum, that actually makes up more than 50% of their digestive tract. That is the part that is designed for breaking down all of that grass. Horses have a simple stomach. They're monogastric, and they're called hindgut fermenter, which means that they are using that bacteria and those microbes to break down that grass and actually ferment it down. So we want to make sure that we are being very conscious of that when we adjust them from a new feed source. And that's why whenever you get a bag of feed or you're reading about how to transition a horse from feeds, that it says take about 10 days to transition them slowly. And that's why, because those microbes need time to adjust to that new pH. So this is a lovely photo from Oklahoma State that discusses, kind of really gives you a picture of that. And you can see that 63% of their digestive tract is made up of that hind gut. And where the foregut, which would be the small intestine and the stomach, and then the esophagus, is only about 30% of their 37% of their digestive tract. So this is where your grain's going to be processed, and then here is has the capacity to actually break down all of that grass. So whenever they're eating a forage, it's basically just passing through the stomach and then moving into this area to be processed. So I just want to give just a couple of pictures here to kind of talk about, again, the nature of horses and how they graze. And you can see there's a lot of horses in this paddock, and I'll talk about this particular location later. Um, but they keep this graze down very, very tight. Anytime new grass shows up, they're there. They know where it's at and they keep it down, which, as you can imagine, we don't get a lot of forage growth there. We, in other parts of this pasture, you see gullying and runoff erosion issues, as well as parts that are have a lot of pugging or mud bogging just from constant animal traffic. And then on the right side of the screen, I have a side-by-side comparison. This is at our farm where we had my horse grazing on the left-hand side of the picture and then my sheep grazing on the right-hand side of the picture. So we had a fence line that ran between these two. And I believe I had him there for about the same amount of time. Granted, the horse, we left him there longer than we should have because we let it get down that short. But you can see just how close he got to the ground. And a sheep will graze close as well, but the way that their mouth works, they just don't have a horse will get a hold of a grass and pull it out by the roots and just really do a lot of damage. So it's just something to keep in mind, and I just like to show the comparison. So damage caused by grazing from livestock. I love this picture. Anytime I talk about anything grazing, I always have it in my slideshow at least one time. Um, so again, due to the selective nature of their grazing and the shape of their mouths, they can get very close to the ground. So it's not uncommon for them to take 80% of the top growth if they're allowed to. Um, extremely close grazing of any kind, whether it's sheep, goat, horse, it doesn't matter, will start to significantly impact the regrowth in the root system of plants. So if you ever hear grazers of any kind talk about managing their grass, they say they like to go by the take half, leave half method. So when we take about 50% of the grass, we're only reducing the root growth by about 2 to 4%. So it can still uptake the majority of the water, the majority of the nutrients, and continue its processes like normal. Whenever we take just 10% more, we are decreasing root function by almost 50%. That's critical whenever we're talking about times of drought or times that the plants are slowing down growth anyway. During the hot summer, our regen is going to be a lot slower. And then if the animals are allowed to continually graze and come back, they'll just keep hitting it back, hitting it back, hitting it back. And so eventually you'll lose grass, you'll get bare spots, and you'll start to see more weed emergence. So that can increase weed pressure. And then you can also see mud issues and compaction arise. So the roots play a really important role in water penetration and filtration, and they also play a big role in keeping the soil held together. So again, hot summer days, whenever we get a drought like we had this past summer, that can really compound issues. And it's not just an issue for this year. Any spots that I allowed severe overgrazing on this summer, I will probably have issues with next year unless we overseed or do some reseeding to help correct that. So that is all of that is not to say that we shouldn't graze. Or have horses on pasture. I am a big proponent of continuous 24-hour pasture. I think the health benefits for the horses make it worth any trouble that you would have. I mean, horses are naturally grazers and roam in herds whenever we see them in the wild. They're roving bands. They enjoy being together. They enjoy moving about. And so I think pasture is vital to them whenever you can provide it. So pastures can reduce boredom, provide that natural exercise, decrease herd aggression. So if you have a big enough pasture and you can do a lot of commingling, or you can keep your herd group together 24/7, it'll help with that aggressive behavior. If they're out on pasture all the time, you can also see less issues during feeding times because mealtime is not always as big of a deal. Or you may not be feeding grain at all because you're supplementing with forage and grass. And it's visually pleasing. It's so nice to drive down the road and see this lush green pasture and these horses out grazing. It's very pastoral. And so having that pasture there can be a great added bonus just visually. Um, and it can be a great way to have open ground if you have the field, if you have the pasture already, or you have a hay field. It can be a great way to get the animals out there and spreading the manure naturally. I'll talk a little bit later. Manure management's not as simple as that on pasture. And then it can reduce the need for stalls or barns. So if you have limited infrastructure and you have enough space, pasturing could be a great option. Like I said, there are a lot of really good benefits to it. In my personal experience, my family has standardbred racehorses, and they are stalled the majority of the time due to their training regimen, things like that. Whenever we have a horse that's retired or they kind of take their winter vacation and they get to go out on pasture, we do see big reductions in things like cribbing or pawing or any wall kicking, those boredom behaviors that we tend to see when they're stalled a lot. Um, So establishing or renovating pasture. I've talked about, pasture is really awesome. We should try to provide that. And it's also important to keep in mind that we want to care for our pastures. So how do we get this pasture established, or how do we renovate a pasture that we have currently that needs some help? Um, One takeaway that I would offer, and it's not always feasible, it's not always possible. If you do not currently have the horses on the property that you're planning to put them on, um, take the time to construct your dry lots, heavy use areas, any kind of, if you're going to put in any sort of rotation system, build that before the horses get there. Because it's much easier to do it all correctly the first time than to go back and retroactively fix things. That being said, I recently moved and we just moved right in and we're planning on doing all that this spring, and we have the horse there right now, and we're doing the best we can. So I recognize we don't have all the money in the world or all the time in the world. And so we do the best we can with what we have. Um, but I say in a perfect world, try to get as much done as you can before you bring the animals to the property. So the first thing we want to do whenever we're establishing the actual pasture is start with a soil test. Some of the handouts that I have will give examples of how to take soil tests and the pattern to use. Um, and then again, if possible, if you're planning out a brand new pasture and you're putting in the fence, take a look at that property and take the time to figure out where you're going to have high traffic areas, like around the water or around stabling areas or around lean-tos, those kinds of things, and kind of think about where would we put these to maximize our space and reduce our damage. Um, Correct any soil fertility issues before seeding or planting. So if you're planning on seeding new pasture and we've taken our soil test, we want to correct those issues before we seed to give our seed the best possible chance. Um, so assess your problem areas and then make a plan to work around them. So I know that's not what that says. I just read it. But assess those problem areas, look at them, and plan to work around them. There's a farm that I drive by on my way home from work all the time that has a really nice pasture. And one thing that they've done is they have a low-lying area next to a creek that spends probably 70% of the year being really soft and muddy because of the creek floods out. So they've just taken a single temporary line of fence and ran it around there, and they exclude the animals from that area anytime that it's wet or muddy. So most of the time. But if it's dry, they'll let the animals go in there to graze. So make sure that you have a plan in place to help avoid those problem areas because they won't go away. They'll just get worse, and they can create you other issues too. Um, if you can, again, if we're establishing new pasture or renovating pasture, control weeds in preparation for seeding. So that can be clipping off weeds to prevent them from going to seed, if you can do that during the season. If you have particular weed areas that you're going in and building new pasture, assessing and then using the appropriate herbicides that can be really helpful to do before the animals get there, so that way you don't have to worry about grazing restrictions on different chemicals. Pasture health. So I am of a background of also being very interested in soil health and promoting good grazing practices. So not only do I want really good practices, really good pasture for our horses and their health, but I also want to make sure that we are treating our soil right and doing a good job with our pastures. So high quality forage comes from high quality soil. So if we take really good care of our soil and make sure we have a good soil microbiome and we have really good roots in the soil and we have good water holding capacity, we're going to have a better quality forage come from that. Certain weeds can be indicators of nutrient deficiencies. So things like the red root pigweeds can signify either an iron manganese ratio that's out of balance, or it might indicate other potassium or magnesium issues. And then another weed that we would see pop up quite a bit would be something like curly dock. So curly dock really loves compacted soil with like a low calcium. Um, and then something like uh, foxtail barley is low calcium, high magnesium, going to be really compacted, poorly drained soils. So that's not always the case. Just because you see weeds in your pasture, it doesn't mean that your soil fertility is low, but oftentimes it can be an indicator, and it is oftentimes an indicator that our pasture health is a little out of balance because we have a lot of weeds growing, and weeds grow, they're very opportunistic. So they grow whenever other things won't, or they can outcompete things. So keeping an eye on the weeds that you have, doing a little bit of looking, you can kind of figure out which weeds like which conditions. Again, good soil health is going to improve your drainage and your water holding capacity, which will help you keep the animals on pasture longer and keep your pastures less muddy. Um, really, really important for pasture health, allowing your forage to reach the correct growth stage before grazing it again. So allowing for that rest period before we put the animals back on pasture is going to be better for us in the long run. It can also be helpful to restrict that grazing um, on brand new flushes and hold them back until it's a little more optimal for grazing, not only for our grasses, but also for our horses. Because, like we talked about, that new green growth is going to contain lots of water, concentrated sugars, and it's going to move right through the animal and negatively impact that gut biome. So we can dual purpose help our animals out and also help our pastures out. So a little bit about pasture fertility, which is going to be really important to maintaining the longevity of your grasses. Um, so I just have a comparison here between hay fields and pasture fields, just because they are different. But some of us may have both on our farms because we are going to probably need hay for our horses, even if we are really good pasture managers. So hay land tends to be uniform productive land because a lot of folks are raising hay as a crop. They may be raising it for multiple years in a row and then turning it over. So hay fields are going to go through periodic deep tillage. So whenever we transfer from a alfalfa crop and we might go into some grasses, we're going to do a deep tillage and rip that out and switch to grasses, or we're going to do a deep tillage and then replant. Um, Short-lived perennials. So alfalfa is the primary crop that you would see grown in a lot of hay fields. It's not the only one. We do have a lot of grass hay fields, as mixed grass hay fields as well. But if we're thinking about that, alfalfa is going to be a short-lived perennial. Um, Our hay fields with our mixed forages are going to be really sensitive to pH and then phosphorus and potassium because we're trying to keep it in that really productive level. And then we also we're looking at maximized production. So we are looking at growing the most amount of forage that we can and then harvesting it at just the right time. So we want it to be the best quality forage for the volume and then also the best quality forage for the nutrients that it contains at that time. So we're trying to hit it just right at that perfect cycle where we can harvest it. It's going to be high nutrient removal. So we are cutting that off and we are taking it off of that hayfield and it's not getting any of those nutrients back because we're removing that organic matter from the field entirely, taking it to a different place. So we are often going to need annual potash and potassium fertilizations because we are removing those nutrients in that hay whenever we take it away from our field. So pasture land is going to be typically, not always, irregular land and less productive. So traditionally, we can't do anything else with it. We'll put it into pasture. So because of that irregularity and because it is often continuously inhabited, deep tillage is going to be pretty difficult. It's not going to be impossible, but it's going to be pretty difficult for different reasons or for various reasons. Our grass-based, they're going to typically be a grass-based system, especially when we think about horses, and they're going to be longer-lived perennials that are a little more sturdy. Going to be very sensitive to nitrogen applications because we're going to get those nitrogen spots. So we may be getting lots of nitrogen from manure, but as you know, horses like to hang out in one spot or they all congregate around the round bale. And there's going to be a lot of manure in one spot and no manure in other spots. So we're either going to have to find a way to distribute that or we're going to be making some applications. Maximize persistence. So we're trying to keep our pastures going for the long haul so we don't have to go in and rehaul them every couple of years. And we are going to have a lot of nutrient recycling because those animals are eating that crop, but then they are putting it right back out there. So the management part's going to become distributing those nutrients more equally. So fertility management. And I have a couple other slides about dragging pastures as well. But if you can, every so often, if you can run some sort of drag through the pasture to help distribute that fertility, whether that is an actual piece of equipment. I have a friend that has horses in Southern Illinois, and she uses a cattle panel. She drags behind the four-wheeler. And so there's all different options that you can use for depending on the size of your pasture and your terrain. After your soil testing, you can use these results to help calculate your nutrient needs. University of Kentucky has a really great resource for calculation, and the Illinois Agronomy Handbook has really good chapters and a really good chart on soil pH. So soil test values for your average pasture. Again, this will vary depending on the type of forages you have in your pasture, but generally, we're going to be looking at a 6 to a 7 for mostly grass pasture. And then if you've got a lot of legumes or you are growing a alfalfa hay crop, you're going to want that a 6.5 or lower, or 6.5 or lower. No, 6.5 or greater. My less than greater than signs are very difficult for me. So a greater than a 6.5. And then we're looking at a target that organic matter of 2 to 3%. I will say, if you are taking a soil sample of your pasture and you have just a traditional continuous pasture, you may want to break it up into sections and take several different samples to send in because the area of your farm where they stand around the round bale or they stand around the barn and produce a lot of manure is going to have a lot higher organic matter and nutrients in it than that far corner of the pasture that nobody wants to go to. So take a couple different samples so that you can maximize and then target your fertility applications. So Generally, our phosphorus is going to be somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds an acre. Potassium is going to be 260 to 300 pounds an acre. And then some of our micronutrients here. So I've mentioned soil pH a couple times, and it is very important because if we don't have good soil pH, even if our soil test says that we should have all the nutrients right, we might still be seeing deficiencies in certain areas because of the nutrient interactions that they're having with each other. So you can see this handy dandy little chart that talks about that's why we want our pH somewhere between a 6 and a 7 because it has the most bioavailability of all of the nutrients that we need, and we're not seeing any of the interactions that you can get whenever you have too much of one nutrient and not enough of another. So here's a chart that I was talking about from the agronomy handbook. You can find the agronomy handbook online, and you can find this particular chapter. So just really briefly to point it out here, this is what you would use in a tillage system. And then this down here is for the forage system. So obviously I put my text right over the top of it so I couldn't read it. But um, the important thing to realize is that if you're doing a surface application, so you're not incorporating it, you only want to use a third of the rate that you get. So you would put that on maybe 3 years in a row. So you'd put a third on this year, a third on next year, and a third on the year after that. Because otherwise you'll have too much lime on there and you'll over fertilize the very, very top or over lime the very, very top part, and then it won't get to where you want it to. And so that's just something to keep in mind. So planting forages. So I have this cool season chart here just to kind of point out. Obviously, the dates are a little too small to read, but generally what we're seeing is here is we're going to get that big spike, that big flush in the spring months whenever it's cool, and then we're going to get a big belly out right here in June, July, and August whenever it gets really hot. And then we're going to see another spike from the end of August till December whenever we get a hard freeze. So you're going to see those grasses kind of spike up and down. And what some folks will do and what we recommend for cattle grazing sometimes is if you need to or if you can, in this lull where there's not that much growing anyway, you can go ahead and if you have a dry lot, you can pull your horses off to that dry lot and put them on hay for a couple of months. Give that a chance to rest and not just keep pounding it, and then you can put them back in the fall. So if we're going to plant forages, depending on the species that we're planting, we can do what's called frost seeding, which is a broadcast seeding either in the late fall or very early spring, and the freeze and thaw of the ground will help work that seed into the soil and seed it. A couple of things with that, if we have really strange weather patterns or sometimes birds will eat them, so you want to put your seed on a little thicker than you would if the recommended rate for drilling or planting it. Again, make sure you allow enough time for the plants to reach the correct maturity before grazing them. If you have access to a no-till drill, that can be a really great way to put seed down. Broadcast seeding can be simpler because again, you're just going out and essentially throwing seed in a pattern. If you have a broadcast seeder that can put it on, and that both of these options can be a little simpler than a full-scale renovation where we're doing tillage and incorporating fertilizer and then putting seed down. Most of the grass species that we have are going to be cool season, so we're going to see that pattern. And this is a recommended seeding mix from the University of Kentucky. So this is the novel endophyte-free tall fescue was their recommendation. I will say here in Illinois, and especially in Southern Illinois, we see in any of our pastures the endophyte fescue, which is what causes your pregnancy and foaling issues in brood mares where you get the milk poisoning. It's really hard to keep endophyte-free fescue out of your pastures just or endophyte fescue out of your pastures because it just kind of creeps back in, even if you plant endophyte free. So follow the recommendations of either not grazing on a fescue pasture or removing your horses a certain amount of time before they give birth to make sure that you're not at risk of the fescue poisoning. And that's for foaling. So 30% tall fescue, 30% orchard grass, 25% bluegrass, 10% perennial rye, which is different than cereal rye or annual rye. And then 5% white clover. And this was for a no-till drill or to be seeded, not broadcast. If it were broadcast, it would be a higher amount. So 30 to 40 pounds an acre in August to September. And again, that's from the University of Kentucky. So at least for the southern half of the state, the climate and everything is going to be pretty similar. Another thing that you can do, and we've experimented with this here on our farm, is to add in some cover crops. So cover crops are going to be something that can do a couple of different things. So they can provide extra short-term forage. If you are trying to up a little bit of the protein in your forage offerings, adding some of the clovers in, something like a berseem, is going to boost your protein provided in your forage. And then we've got things like turnips and radishes, which are going to, the horses may not eat them, but they are going to do really great things for soil compaction. And then when they break down, they're going to put nutrients back in the soil. We have cattle too, so we put down turnips, and the cattle will eat the tops off the turnips and then go back and get the turnips too. So you can also overseed legumes. So just broadcast overseed legumes. If you're going to plant a cover crop, generally we're going to seed that in August or September to make sure that we get some growth up before we put the animals back on in the fall. And then they could be on that either until it's grazed to the appropriate level, or it freezes off in the winter. So weed management. Even if you are the best rotational grazer in the world, horse pastures are probably going to need mowed to prevent weeds from going to seed. My horse is very picky, and if there's a weed, he just ignores it. He's not like a cow where they'll grab a big swath of grass and then they'll also pull some weeds up. They're very selective and they are really good at dodging those weeds. So you're probably going to have to clip once or twice at a minimum to keep the weeds from going to seed and keep the heads clipped off. Herbicides are an option. Get lots of questions with when to spray, how to spray, people being very concerned about grazing restrictions and their animals getting sick and things. And that's really important to read and follow the label. So herbicides can be selectively sprayed on weeds. If you're doing a full pasture reno and you're going to rip it up and start all over from fresh, you could do some sort of broad spectrum herbicide that would kill everything. But since most of our pastures are mixed, we are probably going to have to do selective spraying, because if we spray something that is a grass specific herbicide, it's going to kill all the grasses in there. And if it's a broadleaf specific, it's probably going to kill all of our legumes. So that's why I say pretty selective spray on the herbicide. Managed grazing and good fertility is also going to really help. So if we can keep our grass really healthy, it's going to work to outcompete the weeds. We're still going to have to mow, and we might have to do some hand removal. Another thing that can be helpful is if you have the ability, multi-species grazing can be really great. So that doesn't necessarily mean grazing the animals together at the same time, but if you can put horses, if you have your horse there and then you have some cattle or the neighbor has cattle and you want to let them graze it, that can also help because they will eat different species of grasses. The cattle may eat more weeds. Goats and sheep like browse, so more of the woody plants. So that can help balance things out as well too. And again, really important, get that soil test every 1 to 3. One every year is a little excessive to me. 3 years is a good spot to be for maintaining proper fertility. So calculating stocking density. I love this quote. I believe it's from University of Oklahoma. How much forage a horse can eat and how much forage a horse will eat are two entirely different things. So what they actually need to sustain themselves and what they will eat if they are allowed to are not the same thing. So when we think about stocking density and doing some controlled or managed grazing, um, we want to think about how many horses we can actually put in the area that we've put there. Um, Horses are very difficult in comparison to other livestock animals to get an accurate stocking density, and it's also difficult to figure out what they will eat, what they won't eat. So all of these things, quality of the forage, palatability, exposure to it. So if a horse comes from an area where they've never experienced that kind of forage, they may not want it because foals learn from their mothers what's poisonous and what's not. So if they've never encountered a forage, they may need to graze alongside other horses that are from that area to kind of figure it out. Um, Supplemental feeding. Another great quote in one of the articles is they're talking about supplemental feeding can actually greatly reduce the amount of time that they spend grazing, not only because they are getting extra food so they're not as hungry and this time they actively spend eating, but they said the time that they spend waiting for you to come feed them, they are not actively grazing. So that's something else to think about. And weather will influence the amount of forage intake as well. I put this on here. Horses should generally be less densely stocked due to aggressive tendencies. So anyone, whenever you have horses, and I don't mean aggressive tendencies as in that they are more likely to attack things. I mean, some of them are. But what I mean is whenever horses get into an interaction or an altercation where they're trying to determine pecking order, even if it's not necessarily true aggression, those tend to be more lively or violent than whenever cows or sheep do it. And so the risk of damaging fence or getting pushed into an area where they can't get out of is greater than cattle, for example. And so just keeping that in mind, making sure they have enough room to get away from each other and be able to have those little tiffs and then separate. And so that's important. So because I've said how complicated calculating stocking rate can be, I had to put in my crazy little pixelated transition. Um, Before we think about that, I just want to briefly mention calculating the dry matter intake. So this can be really helpful whether you're feeding forage or if you are feeding hay as a majority of their dry matter intake. So healthy horses will generally consume around 2% of their body weight. And the data generally shows that they aren't going to eat more than 3% of their body weight, just again, because based on the structure of their stomach and their hind gut. So if we assume 2% on 1,000 pound horse, and they're going to eat around 20 pounds of hay a day. And so, that is assuming they have a 60 pound square bale, which, is a little light maybe. You're going to be feeding about 120 bales a year. So again, any animal in work, lactating mares, growing animals, or horses that have, in the winter time, they're going to eat a lot more because they're producing body heat and trying to stay warm. So that's a general calculation. But the reason that that's important is to understand their intake based on forage. And so this is an animal unit. You'll see it used a lot. Generally, it's based on body weight. So 1,000 pound, a cow is considered one animal unit. So if you look at stocking, they will say so many animal units per acre based on an amount of forage. So I have a couple of charts that show that, and then I'm going to say why I don't necessarily agree with this. So when we look at forage that our pastures can produce, this is a fescue. We'll just look at our fescue and legume mix. So this is pounds per acre per inch. So each inch of forage or each inch of forage height is going to be this many um, pounds per acre for the year for estimated dry matter. And so if it's you know 6 inches tall, then it's going to be approximately 2,400 pounds of dry matter whenever we look at that. So not per year, but whenever we measure it and do the calculation. So we can, if we look at our dry matter intake and our stocking density and how much they will eat a year, we can come up with a rough figure that will help us with stocking density. And if that were with other classes of livestock in comparison to the animal units, we'd have a pretty good answer. So stocking density. I've shown you these equations and I've shown you these charts. Even if we do those calculations and we get our rate figured out, and let's say it says 1 animal unit per acre, I would say, general rule of thumb, you're going to need 2 acres, 2.5 acres per horse if they're on pasture 24/7, 365, because we need room for them to move around. We need the pasture to have a break. We need, that's what it's going to take. That's an overabundance of forage for a single horse or 2 horses, but we're not giving that pasture any rest. And so we're going to want to allow that space. The other thing is that it's not only about the amount of forage that the pasture can actually supply for our nutrients. It's going for our nutrients for a horse, but it's also going to be about reducing the damage. And so that's why I say that number is that high. You can tweak it if you do, really good pasture management. But if you're like, I just want to build a pasture around my 3 acres and be done with it, you could probably keep 1 to 2 horses out there without an issue. When you start getting more horses, you're going to start seeing problems. Generally, you're going to be better off understocked than overstocked because you can clip and mow and things to help manage your forage growth. But if you have too many, you're going to start seeing some negative impacts. So I've got these 2 pictures here. The one on the left with the paint and the bay. This is that same pasture I showed earlier with all the horses standing around. This is one of the round bale feeding stations, and you can see we have this really big conglomeration of old hay and manure and stuff, and this is a feeding site where they're trying to reduce the damage. I will say this pasture it's about 9-ish acres, 9.5 acres if you count the dry lots. But it has somewhere around 20, 25 horses on it a year. And they are continuous pasture. And while that is awesome for exercise, and we saw very, very little herd aggression, no issues introducing new horses because it was a really big group. They had plenty of space to get away from each other. They had multiple feeding sites, but very, very little grass produced. So the animals are fine. They're eating lots of hay, but it's not really necessarily the best for the health of the pasture. On the other side, we have this is a picture that I took at SIU, and they have, I think these were yearlings, so this was taken in about May, so these were foals from the previous year, so they were 1-year-old foals in this pasture, and this pasture is about 3 acres as well, and they've got 3 horses on it, but they bring these foals in, and they also have supplemental hay. But they bring the foals in the nighttime because they're breaking these colts to lead, and so they're bringing them in. So a max probably of 12 hours a day that they're out on this pasture. In the off season, they do maintain a single breeding stallion in this paddock, and he would be out there about 12 hours a day too, and never, you never see an issue. You see an issue up here where they feed, but that's pretty normal. We could put in like a heavy use pad to help mitigate that. See that I'm running out of time. I'm almost done, I promise. So I'm overstocked, but I still want to pasture. I think pasture is really great, and I still want to do this. I encounter this in my personal life. So what can we do? We can limit our grazing, and that can also help our horses too. So if you have a horse that has a metabolic issue, or if you have a pony or a donkey, limiting them, keeping them to a dry lot, we're probably going to be doing that anyway. If we can allow them grazing, really the best time to do that is going to be in the very early morning because the plants have depleted quite a bit of their carbohydrates through all of their activity at nighttime. So in the late evening, whenever the sun has just gone down, that's whenever plant carbohydrates and plant sugars are at their highest because they've stored it up all day from all of that sunshine. And then if you put them out at dusk, there's going to be really high sugars. So a normal horse that's been on the pasture all the time, it's not going to bother them. But if you have a horse or a pony that has maybe they have a laminitis or they have foundered or you're dealing with metabolic issues, if you want to let them graze a few minutes in the morning and then slowly adjust them into being on pasture and pulling them off somewhere between 10 and noon. Um, Intensive management strategies and timing are really going to be key to keeping your pasture up. So we just had a freeze here where the ground was really, really hard. And my horse was doing no damage to the area that he was in because the ground was frozen. It thawed out and then it rained for 4 days. And now is the time that we're holding him in a dry lot. So he's doing damage to one area, but I'm protecting my pasture for whenever the conditions are better. So having a dry lot is going to be important. Moving that manure around, planting cover crops, mowing to control weeds, hand pulling weeds. All of these things are going to really help you if you want to get the most out of your pasture and try to protect it as best you can. So how many horses, how many acres, how many hours? So limited grazing to 8 to 10 hours a day is going to be beneficial to your pasture to allow rest. Um, if you have enough pasture to graze 3 horses for 8 hours, you could also graze 6 horses for 4 hours each. So you put 3 out in the morning, and then you bring them in, and then you put your other 3 out for the other 4 hours. So that's the duration on the pasture is how you would calculate that. You can also use temporary fencing to prevent back grazing and to rest the pasture, so to segment the pastures. You can use temporary fence. I will say make sure you have a really good perimeter fence and that you're doing the majority of your temporary fencing on interior fences. So heavy use pads and sacrifice areas are going to be really, really nice and helpful to turn to whenever we have adverse weather conditions. So dry lots, if you're going to build a dry lot, which is a holding area where there should be no grass at all, you're going to want to provide around 400 square feet of space per horse, not including the shelter. So the shelter is going to be another 144 square feet or so. And so that should be per horse per um, per shelter. So if you had 2 horses, you want to double it, etc. Fences of a dry lot should be sturdy and not easy to damage. So whether that's some sort of solid paneling attached to a fence post or a really good electric fence or woven wire that has a tip out to keep them from walking it down, because that's not a huge amount of space and we want to make sure that they aren't getting into trouble. And you would, if you were holding them completely off grass, you're probably going to want to, you are going to want to provide supplemental hay if they aren't getting any grass at all. If you're constructing a lot, try to build it with good drainage and a 4 to 6 degree slope if you can to help move water off of there so that it's not turning into a muddy, mucky mess. You can put down footing for a heavy use area. So heavy use pads are going to be placed at gates or maybe where animals tend to congregate. So if you have a feeding station, you might have a heavy use pad there. So they're going to be easy to clean off. They're going to reduce the mud and the packing that's going to happen. So you are going to have muddy areas. There's just not really a good way around it. But if you can, having a really good heavy use pad in key areas is going to be really helpful. And again, University of Kentucky has a really good diagram. University of Minnesota has a really good video on how to build a heavy use pad. So you're going to do that textile fabric, that geotextile, which is going to help keep your rock material from sinking into the mud, and then your bigger size rock, and then either like a crushed lime or a crushed concrete or something at the top to help pack that all down. rotational grazing is another strategy that you can use. So you can subdivide larger paddocks with temporary fencing. So he's in a large paddock that I've just made him a little lead out, and this is on a solar fence charger. It's a single wire. It's nice and wide so he can see it. Um, you can also use this to create lanes. I've got a good picture later on of lanes and paddocks that are really helpful. But you can use lanes to help reduce the damage to a specific area. Again, having a dry lot where you can feed hay will be helpful in times that the weather is not cooperative. You can also build track systems to encourage exercise and decrease damage to the rest of the field. Again, keep in mind there's no one size fits all solution to this. So I just want to like make sure that what works for you is good. So this is a really good diagram that I like. These are obviously cows, but it shows the manure distribution in our watering feeding area. This is a good rotational grazing. I have found in my experience that this sort of traditional rotational grazing is going to be better for horses just because they do need these bigger paddocks to move around in. You might have some instances where you can really subdivide, but again, horses are going to want to play, they're going to want to fight a little bit, they're going to fuss, and you could get lines that get broken, and they're going to go at a full gallop and not be able to stop whenever they get to temporary fencing. So, having maybe just bigger subdivided paddocks is going to be easier. And then again, this is just what really good grazing can do. Again, these are cows, not horses, but I like the example anyway. So these are some really great drawings from Penn State, University of Minnesota. And then this bottom left hand is an aerial drawing. A friend of mine put in a track system. So the outer red line is the perimeter fence, and the interior red line is a temporary fence done with just a little step-in plastic posts and then temporary poly tape or fence tape. The purple areas are round bales, and then the blue area is the main feeding station and the water. And what she did was sometimes throughout the year, she would strategically block off parts of the lane so that the horses had to walk. So she'd maybe put a block right here in the corner so that if they were coming from this round bale, instead of going right here to the water station, they had to go all the way around to get to the water. And that was to help encourage exercise. Um, the University of Minnesota picture has a really great example of having a lane out. So they may have far away pastures, but then they have lanes and gates that they can open and close to allow animals to have access. And then this is a really traditional 4 paddock rotation. Here are some resource links that Grant already has in a Word document, so you can check these out. They have really, really great resources. Like I said, that University of Minnesota has awesome, awesome horse resources. So there's University of Kentucky and Penn State and Rutgers. They all have awesome resources. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, we got time for questions, so if folks want to put some in the chat box. I don't see any just yet, but I'll kind of kick us off, Katie. Are there any cover crops that maybe we should avoid planting?
That's a good question. So some of them they're just not going to eat. So some of the like annual grasses that are some of the like cereal rye or I always get my ryes mixed up. The